Good afternoon, and welcome to today's event, which is part of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center's current public event series, Regeneration, and is also a keynote of the Association for Literary Urban Studies Conference. My name is Susan Derwin, and I am the IHC Director. As the public face of the humanities for the campus, the center runs programs that draw upon the expertise, practices, and skills associated with the humanities to support scholars in the production of new knowledge and to empower community members as agents of social change. When my colleague, Eric Prieto, approached the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center about co-sponsoring today's talk, I was delighted for a few reasons. First, because the IHC shares the interdisciplinary orientation of the Association for Literary Urban Studies, one of whose goals is to build bridges between the social sciences, humanities, and architecture and planning communities. Second, because this year, the association's conference is devoted to cities under stress, urban discourses of crisis, resilience, resistance, and renewal, a topic that perfectly dovetails with the IHC's series Regeneration. Since last October, our series has been exploring how societies and cultures move from crisis and upheaval into periods of sustainable and equitable regeneration. And third, because the work that today's keynote speaker will be presenting promises to help us recognize, experience, and appreciate the potential of literary studies to make impactful and transformative social interventions. So thank you, Eric, for giving the IHC the opportunity to collaborate with the Association for Literary Urban Studies on today's talk. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to make sure that you, our audience members, are aware of the question and answer function on your screen. You can submit questions to our speaker at any time during the event, and when she concludes her presentation, we will pose as many of your questions as possible to her. Please be aware that live closed captioning is available today as well, and that today's talk will also be recorded and posted on our website in a few weeks. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would also like to pay respect to elders, both past and present, as well as other Indigenous people present. We are delighted and fortunate to have Caroline Levine with us today. She is the David and Kathleen Ryan Professor of Humanities at Cornell University and the author of 3 books: The Serious Pleasures of Suspense, Victorian Realism and Narrative Doubt, which is the winner of the 2003 Perkins Prize for the Best Book in Narrative Studies, Provoking Democracy, Why We Need the Arts, and Forms, Whole Rhythm Hierarchy Network, the 2015 winner of the James Russell Lowell Prize from the MLA and the Dorothy Lee Award for Outstanding Scholarship in the Ecology of Culture. Professor Levine is currently the 19th century editor for the Norton Anthology of World Literature, and she has written on topics ranging from formalist theory to Victorian poetry and from television series to academic freedom. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome Caroline Levine to present her talk, Infrastructures of Collective Life, a Formalist's Guide to the Climate Crisis.
Thank you so much, Susan. I am really delighted to be here. This is my favorite kind of opportunity for discussion and interdisciplinary discussion with lots of people coming from different walks of life. And so I hope that we can have some really lively discussion afterwards. I am in Marrakesh, Morocco right now. I'm really excited to be linking to all of you. And thanks so much to the conference organizers and to UCSB colleagues and people working behind the scenes for making this possible. Now, the question that I've been asking myself for quite a while now is what the humanities have to offer in this moment of intensifying climate catastrophe. I've been surprised by how often literary scholars say that our work has nothing to do with any kind of actual practical political response to climate change. And some go directly to mourning as our best or maybe even our only response. Lately, I started to see that this isn't just about climate change and that political inaction is actually built into our longstanding methods and values. So today I want to focus on the fields that I call the aesthetic humanities, that is literary studies, art history, visual culture, cultural studies, film and media, all of the humanities really, except for history and philosophy, which I think proceed from different assumptions. And I hope historians and philosophers will pipe in and tell me if indeed I'm right about the differences in our assumptions. So I'm going to be lumping all of those humanities fields that deal with art objects and cultural objects together. The talk will have 5 parts. First, I'll be talking about some assumptions about scale that I think are built into the aesthetic humanities. And I'll suggest that the city is a good scale for us to start thinking with in terms of political action. In the second part, I'll make a case for formalism as a method that can help us to actually solve the problems of living together. And I'll be spending some time thinking about how, in the third and fourth parts, how cities have been experimenting with really great models of responding to climate change, some in better ways than others. So we'll think about good forms and bad forms. And I'll end by thinking about what power we have as humanists to reshape our world. So first, the question of scale. I think the aesthetic humanities has unnecessarily limited our work to small scales, and that's gotten in the way of our thinking about collective life. So take the term collectivity, for example. It's a word that appears a lot across the aesthetic humanities, but it's often left undefined and sometimes really deliberately left undefined. So just in 2021, the wonderful new keywords for gender and sexuality studies, the editors of that, the Keywords Feminist Editorial Collective, go out of their way to say that they don't include collectivity as one of their keywords, and that they prefer to foreground the word race instead, because that make sure that they won't romanticize the project of gathering together and collaborating in the context of white supremacy. So there's often this kind of deliberately undefined relation to the word collectivity. I think of Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia as a really representative example of how our fields address or think of the term collectivity. So for Munoz, collectivity is an emergent relationality that presses against the constraints of our current social worlds, a set of possibilities for social life that can be glimpsed in the here and now, but not fully sketched out or realized here and now. So just that sense of hints and possibilities. Now, Munoz is also representative of the field, I think, in that the moments in text that allow him to talk about collectivity on the large scale, to kind of catch those glimpses of a genuine collectivity, are themselves very small in scale. So he invokes collectivity a lot, large, unrepresentable collectivities, but they mostly flicker into perception by way of the single queer pair. So Frank O'Hara sharing a Coke, James Schuyler's A Photograph, John Giorno's depiction of sex in public with Keith Haring. And there the focus is on the two men and their sexual relations. There's actually a public watching them, but that group is very shadowy and just kind of invoked rather than described. So I think Munoz is really typical of the aesthetic humanities in the sense that while lots of texts and lots of critics ask us to think at scales much larger than the individual or the small group, most do so evocatively, gesturing outward from the small scale to the large, but not sticking to the large scale. Most of the major methods in the aesthetic humanities also explicitly favor the small scale. So close reading, of course, has always demanded attention to the single passage or phrase. And one way that I think that the aesthetic fields are different from history and philosophy is that the aesthetic is understood always to be singular, distinctive, or exceptional. So we focus on the moment of generic innovation or the subtle brushstroke or the swerve from convention, that which makes an art object unique. Now, while cultural and historical approaches on the first glance might seem more expansive, they often begin from what Clifford Geertz called exceedingly extended acquaintance with extremely small matters also. What's strange and really interesting to me is that politically minded scholars, including feminist, critical race, indigenous, and disability studies critics, among others, many of whom reject the category of the aesthetic, are just as insistent as traditional aesthetics on the importance of the exceptional instance. So here we focus on subversive desires, refusals of conventions and norms, extraordinary bodies. Critics have been making a powerful case for some decades now that focusing on the very local, concrete, specific instance is the way that you challenge false universalisms and ahistorical generalizations. So then that means that the politics that goes along with a resistance to imperializing knowledge, capitalism, patriarchy, also entails a turn to the small, to close reading, to situated bodies, to the detail. Across the aesthetic humanities, then, it's not surprising that the hugeness of climate change has seemed out of reach of our objects and our methods. The sheer size of the problem has, for some critics, been an argument for keeping our eyes on the small and the local. The Anthropocene is no time for transcendent, definitive mappings, transparent knowledge systems, or confident epistemologies, writes Stacy Alimo. Surely all those things got us into this predicament to begin with. For a lot of critics, the only large-scale politics that won't just re-entrench existing oppressions is that kind of image of a spontaneous global revolution that can't really be imagined in the present. In Jack Halberstam's words, we cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we've torn shit down, we'll inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. From this perspective, any alternatives we might try to plan or sketch out would just reinforce the dominations of the present. So I think this is the logic at work, say in Munoz's Cruising Utopia and in many other works in the field, that the barest hints or glimpses of a different world are the best political work we can do. And any attempt to work at large scales will mean abandoning our most cherished values: aesthetic subtlety and complexity, historically grounded interpretation, and radical political engagement. But it's exactly on political grounds that I want to make the case here that literary studies should be addressing large numbers. There's a whole register missing between dreams of a total global revolution and the small passage or intimate scene. And that register is the polis. Politics is the hard, messy work of living in common with lots and lots of others. One reason I'm particularly excited to have the chance to speak to a whole bunch of humanists who are focused on cities is because the city is, of course, the definitional scale of politics. That's where we get the word politics from. And it's definitional in part because of its scale. So because it's always unnecessarily larger than a few households or a village, it gathers people together who aren't already intimate or connected as kin. In this sense, the polis is the realm of res publica, or public things. But the city is also not so huge that it becomes impossibly abstract or overwhelming. So it's also been one of the scales where publics have actually been really creative and effective in addressing climate change. It's been a scale where we've seen some really effective political action. Of course, cities can't by themselves solve the problem of climate change. So at the end of this talk, I'll propose a method for scaling up beyond the city. But for right now, my major point is that the aesthetic humanities tend not to focus on this definitional scale of the political. Instead, we tend to zoom out from the tiny few in a novel or a film to unrepresentable vastness. And I believe that this actually risks reinforcing one of the dominant ideologies of this neoliberal moment, and that is a withdrawal from the public sphere. So how might we go about shifting the scales of our usual methods in the aesthetic humanities? I'm going to make a case for a turn to formalist methods. In my work, I use the word form more expansively than is usual in the arts to refer to all shapes and patterns and organizations, from sonnets to public transportation systems. And politics, as I understand it, depends on forms. So we have constant battles around the enclosures and borders and the shaping of space or the arrangements of space. We also argue about time and how time is organized, from work routines to voting age to the age of sexual consent. And among the most punishing organizations of social life is the hierarchical binary or hierarchical divisions. In this sense, politics is all about distributions and arrangements. Or to put this another way, politics is the work of giving form to collective life. Now, it's certainly true that many political forms, including racial hierarchies and national borders, are oppressive and violent. And it's for this reason that a lot of radical thinkers have wanted to say that all forms should be resisted or demolished. But all human socialities also depend on orders and arrangements for basic survival. For example, living bodies need nutrients and rest, not just once, but over and over again. You can't have all your food all at one moment. You have to have it distributed over the course of your life. And that means that we really can't do without repetitive rhythms of some kind. So, some people are forced to disrupt their sleep or are unsure about where their next meal is coming from, but usually we consider that to be a deprivation, and that most just societies focus on making sure that people have regular rhythms of sleep and food. Human collectives have also always depended on pathways to get food and water to us and to take waste away from where we live. Shelter, too, has been essential to every human collective. The aesthetic humanities have been justifiably critical of walls and boundaries, but enclosures that protect us from weather and danger aren't only oppressive. There are also forms that allow each of us to meet our most basic needs. Now, forms like rhythms, pathways, and enclosing shelters aren't particularly exciting or subtle, and they can be distributed in deeply unjust and oppressive ways. Not everyone has access to the same pathways or shelters. But they're also what make living in common possible. So they're what I call the infrastructures of collective life. Around the world right now, all of these fundamental forms are under threat. As neoliberal economics undoes hopes of secure work, and as fossil fuels radically disrupt longstanding ecosystems, it seems clear that the most urgent threat facing people around the world right now isn't oppressive stasis, but radical instability itself, intensifying poverty and food insecurity, floods and droughts, violent conflicts over resources, and the rapid extinction of species. Stability and predictability have been bad words for artists and intellectuals, but I also think they've been much too easy for those who are privileged to take for granted. Open-endedness and unpredictability aren't primarily sources of pleasure and excitement for those who are anxious about finding their next meal or a safe place to sleep. To my mind, the philosopher who best captures the political task before us is Potawatomi thinker Kyle Powys White, who coins the term collective continuance, which he defines as a society's overall adaptive capacity to maintain its members' cultural integrity, health, economic vitality, and political order into the future, and avoid having its members experience preventable harms. So intergenerational stability is crucial to justice in this definition. I especially love White's definition because it isn't some static top-down goal or some superficial fix, and it's not about dictating one particular way of life. He argues that different collectives have built different food infrastructures, for example, to sustain collective life over long periods of time. The point is to allow collectives to be able to sustain their own health over long periods. Now, I think White is really right to say that there's no single form or set of forms that will be right for all societies. But I also want to insist that justice isn't radically formless or infinitely various either. There's a limited number of ways we can organize patterns of food and sleep, reliable pathways for clean water, and safe spaces to rest and gather, all of which are being radically disrupted in this moment. So instead of assuming that stable organizations and structures are always the enemy of justice, What if we saw it as our task to build better, more just and egalitarian forms than those that organize us now? What if we drew inspiration not from the merest glimmers of possibility, but from the wide range of ways that communities have experimented with organizing infrastructures for collective life? I don't think this is an easy shift for the aesthetic humanities to make. For decades, we've defined art as breaking from norms and conventions, as critical and as specifically as anti-instrumental, as not being put to use, for some programs or plans or agendas. That's been an important and productive line of thought, and I don't want to dismiss it altogether, but I do think it's also a pretty recent, pretty Eurocentric, and ultimately a pretty narrow definition of art. It basically understands art entirely through the lens of the avant-garde. What if our model instead was design, which puts an emphasis on practical application and use, and which has many artistic traditions in many parts of the world? Both sonnets and public transportation systems are designed and made, which means they can also be redesigned and remade. In this sense, urban infrastructures are not so different from works of art. They're constellations of designed forms working together. So I think we can take the formalist methods we've developed in the aesthetic humanities to objects that aren't aesthetic in the strict sense, but are still forms, the many designs and arrangements that shape collective life. Critics sometimes argue that design serves neoliberal agendas, but I think it has huge potential for structural transformation. As it crosses back and forth between the imagination and the material world, it's the practice of literally reshaping social worlds. So what I'm proposing is that we can use our skills as formalist readers, not only to understand, but also to redesign and remake the polis. But again, this is going to require a pretty profound shift in disciplinary orientation. And I speak from experience. I wrote 3 books that converged around unsettling and dismantling existing structures before realizing how strange it was that I never even imagined a different starting point. And now that I've come to think about stability as a crucial element of justice, I've also come to see that my training as a literary critic has focused my attention so much on gaps and ruptures that I don't have a lot of tools for thinking about what endures, what survives. Most of our major methods, including close reading and historicist analysis, keep our attention on specific and often evanescent moments, the fleeting, that which moves or changes. So I've been experimenting with formalism to see if it can help us understand why some shapes and arrangements last. What forms afford endurance over time? That is, what forms might help us to guarantee collective continuance? So I've been developing a theory of what I call formal endurance. What is it that allows certain forms to last, to survive, to be stable, and therefore predictable for people to be able to rely on them? Well, it makes intuitive sense that the forms that are most likely to last are those that take robust material shape, like buildings and roads. It's my hypothesis, I'm going to say it abstractly here, and then I'm going to work it out through some examples. It's my hypothesis that less substantial social forms like anti-Blackness or patriarchy are most likely to endure when they operate in self-reinforcing configurations with these built forms. So that is when multiple forms work together to support each other in what we might call structures or systems. So I'm going to put forward a theory of formal endurance here. My examples will be a couple of cities that have organized their forms of collective life very differently, but where the forms of life have lasted over time. And so we can think about formal endurance through these 2 examples. My first example is Chicago, and really it could be a lot of different US cities that were organized by the racist practice of redlining. That is the US government legislation that defined certain neighborhoods as too risky for banks to invest in them. So the pinkish color on the map in Chicago were the redline neighborhoods. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration guaranteed loans only in neighborhoods occupied by the race for which they are intended, and where schools should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. So this explicitly racist law then prompted the building of mostly white neighborhoods in the suburbs. And then redlining shaped other forms, like the construction of mass transit systems that link downtown business districts to white suburbs while bypassing minority neighborhoods. So in this account, racial hierarchy, we could say, is the first and most important form, and it then organizes all of these other forms. It separates neighborhoods by race. It then directs connective routes taken by roads, mass transit, and clean water, which then entrenches and deepens poverty and inequality, which in turn feeds a myth of white superiority. Why can't those people just pull themselves up by their bootstraps? And it also writes these forms into the built environment. So that means they last for a really long time. So even after redlining is made officially illegal, minority neighborhoods are still cut off from high quality transportation, education, and labor, and this keeps racialized poverty going. So clusters of interacting forms sustain a racist infrastructure. Now, you might say that the persistence of racial injustice is exactly why we should fight forms and systems, but I'm going to take the argument in the opposite direction to make the case that the durability of this formal model has a valuable lesson to offer those working for justice. That is, if we understand how portable forms work together to reinforce each other over time, maybe we could develop our own more just models to take their place. Constellations of forms that could reliably, predictably, and sustainably produce and reproduce equality. So let me offer the more hopeful example of Belo Horizonte, Brazil, nicknamed the city that ended hunger. In the 1990s, a leftist government there developed a food security system. The city has about 2.5 million people, and at the time it had very high rates of child malnutrition and mortality. The food system is made up of 20 programs, including nutritious school meals, subsidies for fruits and vegetables, training programs for bakers and chefs, seed distribution to school and community gardens, and licenses for food trucks to move around the city as long as they spend a certain amount of time in poor neighborhoods selling fresh foods at a fixed low price. Sorry for the background noise, I apologize. Maybe the best known of all the programs has been what are called the popular restaurants. These restaurants serve locally farmed nutritious meals at very low prices, and they have often a kind of pub-like atmosphere, so they're pleasant places to go. And you can see they attract lots of people from middle classes as well as people who are poor. So you can see students sitting next to elderly people, sitting next to unhoused people, sitting next to professionals. So it doesn't stigmatize the poor. When Belo Horizonte first started its food system, lots of people said, oh, it's just going to collapse with the next economic crisis. It's a fad, it's going to come and go. But now it's been in place for almost 3 decades. People have started to ask how the food system has managed to survive so successfully. So this is my theory rather than what other people say, but it seems to me that as with redlining, the system is sustainable in part because its different elements work so well together in a kind of formal feedback loop. So let me give you the example of the program that's called Straight from the Field. So in this program, small family farms get the government support to grow fruits and vegetables in a sustainable way. And then they are allowed to sell their fruits and vegetables directly to urban consumers at particular public sites. And Belo Horizonte has organized the city such that these sites are places where lots of people gather, like train stations or bus stops, but where otherwise fresh food is not very widely available. So they're food deserts and human hubs. And those of you who have thought about food deserts, I know will immediately recognize that often food deserts in US cities are also formerly redlined neighborhoods. So Belo Horizonte is really smart about the form of the city. You find fresh food at the crossing of 2 different networks, human hub, food desert. And what's most important for my purposes here is that the various forms at work in the Straight from the Field program reinforce each other. So city dwellers get access to healthy food at low prices. Rural farmers have the chance to earn a decent living, which helps them to stem the migration of the rural poor, which helps to stem the migration of the rural poor from urban shanty towns. And that's often a big cost to the city. So having fewer poor people living in the shanty towns takes pressure off city programs, and that frees up more resources for the food system. The city can then train more chefs and urban gardeners and put resources into keeping food quality high. And in fact, overall health, nutrition, and income have all risen substantially in Belo Horizonte since the 1990s. So as with redlining, the interlocking forms of the food security system work to sustain each other over time. Many of these elements exist separately in other cities, but part of what's really brilliant about Belo Horizonte's program is that it was designed so that its administration doesn't belong to any single office of government. It cuts across all of them. So for example, if the next administration decides it wants to cut the budget, it's going to cut the food, the school gardens program. It has to cut it from the education office, the nutrition office, and the environmental office. And the point of this, and it was very deliberate, was to make it hard to dismantle the food system. So it's an integrated citywide system that crosses neighborhoods and classes and municipal departments, and that's really hard to undo. So the form within city government is part of what has made it sustainable over time. Now, Belo Horizonte calls its program a food security system. And I just want to spend a second with the word security. That is the opposite of our usual aesthetics, right? And we usually associate security with our worst nightmares, national security or security forces. What I'm suggesting in this talk is that even those on the radical left could reclaim and revalue security along with predictability, stability, and sustainability as not only necessary, but also a desirable element of political experience. So those of us who have for so long stressed the excitements of radical freedom would start exploring a new and paradoxical kind of radicalism that values designing and building stable forms for the long term. So in this theory of formal endurance, I've sketched out kind of two examples of infrastructures of collective life on the level of the city. And I want to suggest that there's lots of room for creativity in the ways that forms can work together to sustain each other over time, and that cities have been among the places that have been among the leaders in creative experiments in infrastructures for collective life. So Quezon City in the Philippines has recently established new zoning laws to promote urban farming. London and Stockholm have been rolling out successful projects to reduce car traffic and improve air quality. Both Milan and Paris have plans to transform into what are called 15-minute cities, where people can meet most of their needs within a short walk or bike ride from home. And I've also got images of Maastricht and of Barcelona, all doing really interesting greening of the infrastructure. I want to focus on two especially creative urban experiments in redesigning infrastructures for collective continuance. And I've chosen urban experiments that are deliberately not in wealthy cities, because I want to think about what's possible to do with relatively few resources. The first example, which some of you may know because it's been a famous green city for quite a few decades now, is Curitiba, also in Brazil, in southern Brazil, that's very proud of its environmentalist infrastructure. Unlike many other green cities, Curitiba is not a wealthy place. In the 1960s, the city was expanding really quickly, and the government wanted to design a public transportation for the growing population, but they figured out quite fast that a subway was going to be too expensive. So they designed a way for buses to move as quickly as trains in their own designated lanes. And they've kept bus ticket prices deliberately low. So the system is used by 2/3 of the population of the city, which means that there's broad investment in its success. Today, Curitiba has one of the lowest rates of car use and one of the lowest rates of air pollution in the world. So that's one great form, the public transportation system. But Curitiba is really interesting to me because the city designed another green infrastructural form that works together with this one in ways that sustain each other in a kind of virtuous cycle over time. At the same time that they were solving the transportation problem, Curitibans were trying to figure out how to solve a different problem, which is that poor people living in the favelas on the outskirts didn't have any way to get rid of their waste. And so they were dumping garbage in the streets and in the waterways. And this was creating a major health hazard. So the city designed a green exchange program where residents collect bags of waste and exchange them for a range of goods, including food, but also, importantly, bus tickets. It doesn't cost more, it turns out, than it would have, this green exchange program, than it would have if the city had paid a private garbage company to remove the waste. And it has all kinds of other positive effects on collective life. So less trash in streets and rivers has substantially improved environmental health. Infant mortality and rates of disease have dropped. Curitiba has the highest rate of recycling in the world. And this kind of amazing opera house was built in just 75 days from recycled materials. But also, for my purposes, what's really important, the two forms, the transportation infrastructure and the waste infrastructure, support each other and sustain collective life over time. So the poorest residents can exchange their garbage for bus tickets, which means that they can travel to jobs, for example, all around the city. And that in turn lowers poverty rates while deepening the city's overall commitment to public transport. Okay, you're saying, but what does any of this have to do with literary criticism? Surely you're saying we should leave this kind of work to urban planners and architects. But this, our usual logic, leaves the aesthetic humanities, I think, in an odd political place. We can gesture and we can hint, but we can't plan, design, and build. So we can come to the brink of political action and then stop. This seems to me to be an unnecessary limitation of the work that we are capable of doing. Our fields think a lot about justice and a lot about form. We have some crucial formalist skills, which we could bring to the work of shaping the polis, but we generally stop before that moment of design is undertaken. So in my next example, I want to focus on what happens when artists get actively involved in the work of redesigning the infrastructures of collective life, because I think this might give us a model to think with. My example here is not a whole city, but Houston's Third Ward. In the early 1990s, 7 African-American artists raised money to buy a row of 22 small, narrow houses called shotgun houses in this historically Black neighborhood. The houses had been slated for demolition, but the artists saw them as worthy of preservation on both architectural and historical grounds. They also imagined them as places to exhibit contemporary art and draw people to the neighborhood, especially young people who often kind of focus on getting out of the neighborhood, going somewhere else. But at the same time, the artists were really aware that a hip new art scene can reshape a neighborhood in unjust ways, sparking racist processes of gentrification, forcing up rents, and driving existing tenants away. Some people call this art washing. So this group, called Project Row Houses, have been working really hard to build, preserve, and sustain infrastructures for collective life that will be good for both artists and existing residents. Their top priority has been to preserve affordable housing for people already living in the Third Ward. They've now bought 40 buildings to prevent big developers from swooping in. And they formed a partnership with Rice University's architecture school, where students have designed and built small, safe, attractive units using existing row house structures, including a solar power home that's become a model for eco-friendly, affordable housing elsewhere. Now, Project Row Houses deliberately expands its idea of art beyond the professional artists who visit and display their work here. They often invoke Joseph Beuys's notion of social sculpture, which understands everyone as an artist and the social organism as a work of art. From this perspective, all residents of the Third Ward can shape and reshape the environment, and all kinds of everyday activity, including cooking and caretaking, can count as art. So Cookie Love's Wash and Fold Laundromat and the Third Ward Bike Shop, where you can not only get your bike fixed, but you can learn how to fix it yourself, are included in the Arts Collective. Even the Emancipation Economic Development Council, which is a group that joins together churches and local business owners and third world residents and artists, all to fight gentrification, is part of the work of art. So dissolving the usual dividing lines between aesthetics and activism, Project Row Houses redefines collective life as a material and participatory art project. So in the last section, I want to spend a few minutes saying a few words about how the thinking I've been doing has prompted me to a couple of unconventional thoughts about how power works in the aesthetic humanities. In the aesthetic fields, we usually understand forms, both the forms of art and the forms that shape our lives, as the product of dominant ideologies, as flowing from dominant groups and their views and interests. So we think of both our TV shows on the one hand and our work routines on the other hand as flowing from, say, neoliberal or heteronormative or racist agendas. This analysis is not wrong, but I think it misses the ways that stable and enduring forms also themselves help to produce worldviews that aren't always in sync with dominant ideologies. So one of the reasons I've gotten so interested in endurance over time is that I think there may be some enduring forms that last and shape us regardless of the latest ideology, that they're still in place and they're still forming who we are. So let me make this argument by way of another couple of examples. So imagine, first hypothetical, imagine that you grew up in a city with inexpensive, safe, and accessible public transportation. As a teenager, you can explore the many corners of your city. You and your friends can gawk at wealthy homes, you can wander through gay neighborhoods, you can sneak into bars and music venues. And when it comes time to find a job, you can look across the whole city. Now, imagine instead that you live in a rural area without public transit, where houses are spaced so far from each other that you rarely see your neighbors. If as a teenager you want to see your friends, you might have to ask an adult for a ride, and most often you're stuck at home. Confined this way, your primary models for what a grown-up life looks like, apart from the media, will probably be the adults in your immediate household. In the US, your local school will probably be full of people who look just like you, racially and economically. And when you start to look for a job, you'll need to either borrow or buy a car just to get to the interviews. So with these examples in mind, what I want to suggest is that your worldview will probably flow, at least in part, from the shape of the transportation infrastructure that you've inherited, which may have been built several generations before you. So power here isn't necessarily traceable to dominant groups currently in power. And of course, it's true that the public transportation system is the result of human intention and design in the first place. It had to be planned, fought for, and built. Like all infrastructures, it also needs to be maintained over time, and some groups will deliberately allow public transportation systems to crumble. So in this sense, people can make, unmake, and remake forms. But once the public transportation system is in place, it will also give shape to collective life for years to come. So this is a case where a form held over from the past may be able to direct collective life long into the future, even as new ideologies become dominant. Which means that I think one of the best kinds of political work we can do entails the building of just forms for the long term. Now, the other way that I've been rethinking power has to do with our own power as scholars of the aesthetic humanities. As I've suggested throughout this talk, we're very much accustomed to the idea that the nitty-gritty of political change on the ground is not the stuff of the arts or reading. So we retreat from the messy work of trying to remake the polis. But the examples I've sketched out here suggest that the infrastructures of collective life aren't given or inert, and can even take shape and last through and be built in otherwise oppressive regimes. And in the US, a lot of really crucial decisions about just and unjust infrastructures happen at the level of city government, but relatively few of us academics are active in that sphere. So the city is just one really fantastic place to consider investing our analysis and our creativity, a place where it's possible not only to imagine and design, but also fight for and build lasting forms for collective continuance. Okay, but we also know that climate change is happening on scales larger than cities. And even if lots of major cities successfully bring down their emissions, it won't stop the most destructive effects of the climate crisis. So I've been experimenting with formalist methods, not only to fight for forms that will sustain collective life on the urban scale, but also to think about ways to be smart about organizing ourselves as activists for justice on a massive scale. So I want to close by talking about a form that could be, I think, really helpful in building collective political power for climate justice on that large scale. This is the form that network theorists call the hinge. So political movements have often grown by recruiting new members by tapping into existing networks. So unions, churches, families, neighborhoods, schools, colleges. And what happens is that a person might bring her new neighbor to a meeting, for example, and that maybe that new neighbor will tell her cousin about it. And then that person gets so excited that they'll bring their youth group. As the social movement grows, it becomes a vibrant new network of its own, which carries a sense of purpose and belonging that can make it attractive to new members. So the neighbor who invites the person in the first place is a hinge between two networks, connecting the neighborhood to the social organization. So that's an example of a hinge on a small scale. But hinges between networks have the capacity to link large groups and to expand on massive scales also. The example I want to talk about here is 350.org, which has helped to organize the divestment movement. And I think it's a really good example. In 2012, Bill McKibben published an article in Rolling Stone magazine called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math. And then he planned a lecture tour around the United States, appearing in city convention centers and on college campuses with famous speakers like Naomi Klein and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he coordinated with huge numbers of local and national organizations like Greenpeace and Bold, Nebraska. 350.org also convened a week-long gathering of young climate activists from around the world in Istanbul. The resulting campaign has not been a single tightly structured organization with a single goal, but it hasn't been just an agglomeration of a whole bunch of separate actions either. 350.org acts precisely as a hinge between groups offering trainings, support, and opportunities to connect. And it's been successful at growing to very large scales. So today, 1,500 institutions are divesting from fossil fuels, and that's almost $40 trillion committed to divestment. And although divestment isn't the only reason for this, fossil fuels, big oil is definitely doing badly. Its returns have been in trouble for a while. So this is change on a very large and significant scale. When it comes to climate change, no single strategy or organization is probably going to be enough to make revolutionary change on its own. And even a vast aggregation of specific actions may not add up to systemic transformation. And for some people, that's a reason to give up. But to me, it seems like hinges between groups are a crucial form because they focus our attention on the important work of connecting across scales. That is, if we could do effective political work at the level of the city, we can also link and coordinate that work that we're doing with other sites, rural areas and other cities, so that we can combine forces and work together toward the vast and urgent project of collective continuance and climate justice. Thank you so much for listening. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Come back to the group.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. We do have questions and about 8 minutes, so I'm going to jump right in with them. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. The first one is, when talking about the Brazilian city that ended hunger, the reader writes, I wonder, or the audience member, I wonder, is this possible in the USA? I feel as though prices are driven up by the farmers looking for the highest bidder for their product, and in return, every seller in the chain of produce does so as well. This means that whoever pays the most for the freshest food will ultimately sell it at a higher price, unfortunately making it only available to the richer citizens. What are your thoughts on this system being possible in an ultra-capitalist system such as that of the USA?
I mean, it's a great question, and I'm not going to say too much about the details, but I do think it could work in the US. I have been beginning to propose it in Ithaca, which actually has, we're a very small town where I live and teach, but has quite a lot of urban poverty and no public transportation, and a very lively farmers market that is kind of a hub for human activity. And so I do think it's possible. It does take subsidies, that is, rather than just leaving it to the market. We do need to invest collectively in the food system for everybody. So it does take that kind of collective investment. But yes, I think we should try.
Second question, how is what you regard as forms different from what the social sciences would regard as structures? In other words, what can the aesthetic humanities bring into the discussion that the social sciences haven't already?
Yeah, I mean, that is a question I have gotten a lot in my life. And I actually, when I wrote my book Forms, for a very long time, I moved back and forth between the term form and the term structure, and I couldn't decide which one I wanted. And ultimately, I decided on form in part because it's actually a bigger and more capacious term. If you look across fields, it's used across fields. So structure has a very specific set of connotations for us in the aesthetic humanities, and so does form, but both of them have to do with organizations and patterns and the forming of material things. What I think the aesthetic humanities has to offer specifically, I have two answers to that question. One is that what we're really good at in literary studies in particular is looking at how multiple different kinds of forms interact in a given object. So if we look at, I'm going to use the example of a sonnet again, just because it's a ready example, we are able to think about syntactic structures, rhythm, and rhyme scheme, but also images and their repetitions throughout, right? We're thinking about how multiple forms are actually layered on top of one another. What social scientists tend to do, especially quantitative social scientists, is instead to try to limit the number of variables so that you're really understanding one structure, at the most two structures, right? And so one of the reasons I feel confident about the fact that this is in fact something that we do better than the social scientists do is that a couple of very famous sociologists said that The Wire, the television show, does better at showing the experience of urban poverty, at getting at the structures of urban poverty than most sociology, because it doesn't extract just one form or another for the purposes of analysis, but shows us how they work together. So I think that's one thing that we can do. But I do think that we could share a lot. That is to say, I am not convinced that the humanities and the social sciences couldn't both use the language of form to think about both the forms that we analyze and the forms that we write in and work in and use to persuade each other in, that a formalist vocabulary is a kind of meta-disciplinary way of talking. And so that across fields, we could all be formalists.
Who is the we of the aesthetic humanities that you were talking about? Who only work with the evanescent, the gestural? The dominant aesthetic of the Black radical tradition, for example, is improvisation, which is a form that has endured for centuries and that many arts activists of any color employ and have employed for years.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that interests me, and I totally get the force of that question, so I'm not trying to sidestep it. But one thing that interests me is that artists for hundreds of years have been merging arts and activism in really important and wonderful ways. And there's a huge range of examples of that. And the Black radical tradition is one of the richest and most, I think there's so much to study and learn from there. But the aesthetic humanities, that is the critical tradition, tends not to think of itself as turning itself into action or activism. It's not by any means everyone, but a lot of people who do activism separate it from their scholarship, right? They say, my book is not going to do this work. I do it in my community. I do the work in my community. And what I'm trying to do is to put those two things together for the scholars and not so much for the practicing artists, because I think you're right, the practicing artists have been doing it. And I've really just been trying to think that problem recently, like why is it that the premises of the aesthetic humanities stay so committed to what seems to me like what I call the logic of the avant-garde, when there's so much other art out there that's doing other things.
Interesting. All right. Well, maybe as a final question, let me give you the opportunity to elaborate on something that struck me. I'd love to understand more about the difference between formalism as a reading or diagnostic practice on the one hand, and formalism as you're deploying it as a generative tool or political practice, because it seems to me that I want to understand more about how we can see the latter, as that is formalism as a political practice. It's still contingent on the distribution of political power and on sort of the forging of alliances. So what is the difference? Why is it not still diagnostic after the fact rather than generative? How can a formalist be politically
more than simply diagnostic? I'm trying to think of a good example, but it seems to me that we have lots of opportunities around us every day to remake the forms of our lives. So, a household can redistribute the labor across in egalitarian terms, right? Doesn't have to fall into a pattern where, let's say, the man does all of the work outside of the home and the female partner does all the work inside of the home, right? It could be redistributed in a way that's such that there are 3 adults in the household and such that they share the labor, right? We have constant opportunities for that. So, what we tend to talk about structures as the power that keeps, that those are the things that keep us in place, right? Patriarchy keeps us from doing that, right? But in fact, we can remake those structures all the time, depending on our power over our own environments. And of course, that's a big question. But to my mind, what seems strange and troubling is that we don't do that more. That is, like, I'm in a university, all kinds of ways in which the university is doing troubling things, but I can understand the hierarchies, the forms that allow power to flow. I understand what my president can do and can't do. And I can then work with that, for example, to get Cornell to divest, which we did in 2020, right? We figured out, it was a team of us, and we figured out, okay, where does power flow? How does it flow? What are the structures that we would need to get to work together in order for divestment to happen? And it can be successful. So it's an analytic that allows us to then act, right? Because we understand how power works, and then we can, instead of thinking of power as something enormous and overwhelming and unbudgeable, right, which is how I think it's mostly conceived around me and among my colleagues and my students. Instead, we say, okay, so where does it actually, where is the moment where these two networks hinge, or where is the moment where the president is actually not powerful over this? She may or may not care about climate change, but if we do it this way, she actually doesn't have a say over divestment, right? So I think it could be much more creative with the forms that are around us institutionally, and I think it's much I think it's much easier to be diagnostic than it is to be active with them. But I think once you make the connection of like, oh, I see how that form works, it doesn't have to be designed that way, right? We don't have to distribute stipends to graduate students that way. We don't have to do, we're doing this all the time as administrators, right? We don't have to think about tenure in this way or adjunct labor in this way, right? We can constantly rethink those forms, and proposing different and better forms, more just forms, is part of the work that I think we can all be doing more of, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. So our time is up. Thank you. Scanning sonnets will start to mean something entirely new now to us. I thank you for the IHC, for the conference. Thanks to our audience for attending. Please take the exit survey on your way out and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.